What is your status within the US Department of Defense, and do you speak as an official or as a private individual?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure, I can assure you. I love being in Romania. I first came here in 1978, and it's a delight to be back. I have an unusual status within the Department of Defense in that I am a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is owned by the Department of the Navy, part of our Department of Defense. But as of April, the organization in which I reside has fallen out of the Department of the Navy and now under the Department of Defense for a variety of reasons. Administrative reasons, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But I just need to stress, no matter what my status is, if I'm a professor or if I'm working for the Department of Defense directly, I am speaking solely with my personal opinion, and it does not in any way reflect the policy or position of the Department of Defense or the United States government.
Taking in account your experience with Central and Eastern Europe, what is one common pathology shared by defense institutions in the region that inhibit the full adoption of the Western approach to defense?
Just a bit of background on that question. I've spent 19, almost 20 years in the region trying to help ministries of defense, governments, general staffs, services adopt, shall we say, the Western method of defense and military science is what you would call it. It hasn't gone very well if we look at outputs. So we have spent a lot of money, other NATO nations have spent a lot of money, you've spent a lot of money and a lot of effort and time to reform your defense institutions. But I think if you look at the outputs, the ability of the armed forces to do their missions, go to sea, fight and survive, go fly in the air, fight and survive, go on the land, maneuver, fight and survive. It's very difficult to find amongst all of these countries armed forces that are capable of doing that. For 10 years, I didn't think about causation, I'll be very honest with you. I simply was doing the training that I was asked to do by my government. And about 8 years ago, I realized that it wasn't working. And so it bothered me. I had to figure out, what am I doing wrong? What are we doing wrong collectively, both in the Department of Defense, in my government? Are our programs and policies, our concepts, are they helpful? Are they useful? And then on the part of our allies and partner countries, what have you done wrong? Where have you missed opportunities? And so the long answer to your short question is, I had to write a book to figure it out. So I went back to putting on my scholar's hat, and I wrote a book, and I didn't like it, and I wrote it again, and then I rewrote it. I rewrote it about 5 or 6 times until I think I got it right. It was published in London in 2017. It's gotten very good reviews. And one of my key theses is the reason why every defense institution in Central and Eastern Europe is suffering the ability to adopt the Western methods is because, as John Maynard Keynes tells us, and I'm an economist by training in education, he tells us in his general theory that the difficulty isn't adopting new concepts. You've adopted Western concepts. The difficulty is getting rid of the old ones. And so the common pathology is, even in the Baltic states, where there is no successor defense institution, because they were all started ab ovo, as the Latins would say, the Romans would say, from the egg, there are still legacy concepts that are bouncing around in people's heads, and you can see them in institutions. And that's inhibiting you from fully adopting the Western concepts. I think conscription's a good example of that. You got rid of conscription, very good. But have the forces been fully professionalized? You have to ask yourself that question. And if they haven't, what's inhibiting that? So concepts is my message to everybody. The new ones are fine. How do you get rid of the old ones? That is much more challenging. And I think we in the West have been very bad at understanding that the problem is largely conceptual. And I think we've been equally bad at being able to explain that to our allies. Because this, when you get down to it, changing a concept changes people and money. And that's political in the end. It isn't technical. So I think we look at this as a technical problem, whereas in reality, it's a political problem.
And speaking of legacies, mentalities, older mentalities, You have stated that commanders in the region are not allowed to be fully developed by government policies, attitude, and legacy practices. Why is this the case, and how can it be addressed? What is the impact of these factors upon armed forces readiness?
That's an excellent question. 2 points on this. Commanders in the communist period were not empowered. I saw this. I worked in Ukraine for 10 years, and colonels were not able to make decisions at all. You still see this in other countries that are now NATO members. I won't use any names, but you see it in many, many countries where senior leaders, to include even generals, are not allowed to make decisions. All decisions go to the top. That's a legacy. So you have hyper-centralization of control still in many, many countries, as opposed to delegation of control and empowerment. Society. So we say societal norms play to this. I think if you have an Ottoman heritage where you had highly centralization decision making, and I think also those communist concepts where every decision, no decision is too small not to be taken to the top. So this continues, and you can see this very clearly if you look at commanders, whether or not commanders have training budgets. If I'm a brigade commander, if I'm a ship's captain, if I don't have a training budget, how do I train my force? I think too often ministries of defense throughout the region, civilians like myself, defense civilians like myself, don't see money for training and maintenance as being the lifeblood of an armed force. So they will make it available if you're going to go on an exercise, if you're going to go on a deployment. It's no problem, the money's there. But this is what happens to the expertise and training ability of the forces. It should be much more consistent, but it isn't there. As such, because there isn't designated operations and maintenance money, the Armed Forces readiness is in the region, and I just published an article on this in the Royal United Services Institute journal last month, Rusiei in London, where I look very hard at readiness levels, and you don't see readiness because you don't see delegation of empowerment and a delegation of money. So it keeps coming back. You don't allow commanders to grow. And that's huge, because you may have commanders, but they don't have the self-confidence, they don't have the experience. Even if they've been on deployments, which is the best training you could ever have, even if they've been on deployments, they still don't fully, they're not like their Western counterparts, where they are intimately involved with training 24/7, their ship, their aircraft, their battalions. So it's a big problem, and it's a political problem, it's a cultural problem, but it's one that's eventually got to be solved.
Any recommendation, any solutions to solve these problems?
Delegation of budget, delegation of authority. We make it very clear. We tell our commanders, this is what we expect, and you don't perform, we'll get another person. Nothing personal, but we do. Units have training budgets, and commanders have the authority to train their units. And if they don't, there's some very sharp words discussed. But I think the biggest differentiation I can see is that particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, commanders, the opinions and views and judgments of commanders are taken over everything else. We build our commanders up. We stress them, we make them grow, we put them in terrible positions and operations, because we need to see who can do it, who can grow. And then once you're a commander, your recommendations, very few people are willing to override them. So in our system, a commander tells his superiors whether or not his unit is ready. My unit is ready. My unit can do X, Y, and Z today. Nobody judge it. The system really isn't set up to test it. We have exercises and evaluations, but it's that commander's judgment. Here, you don't have that. And here, readiness is determined by these combat readiness evaluations. Oftentimes they're done in Germany with the assistance of the US Army. But I think a lot of armies in particular, they study for the test because it's more or less a checklist, as opposed to the judgment of a commander. saying that unit is ready. That unit is ready to perform its tasks and carry out its mission.
In your writings, you have been very critical of the manner by which the US government has exported the Department of Defense method for managing funds, the planning, programming, budgeting system. How is this method unsuitable to defense institutions in this region? And plus, how is this affecting defense planning long term?
Well, we have to understand this particular method was created in the 1960s to bind together very loosely 5 different ministries of defense in the United States, arguably. We don't have one. And the most important one, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, they don't really have a budget. Money is determined, where it's spent and how much is determined by Congress. And the money more or less directly goes to the military departments, Army, Navy, and Air Force. Defense agencies, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Those individuals who tried to pull it together in the 1960s, and I've written extensively and published extensively on this, they compromised. They never really changed the way the money flows. So it's really, the money comes in this way uniformly and it goes out that way uniformly. So the military departments continue to run with very little supervision or influence by the Secretary of Defense or the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's a very unique method. And many secretaries of defense, even while they're in office, and almost all of them after they leave office, critique this budgeting system because they can't touch the money. And we even have instances where my own former boss, shall we say, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, has complained, I cannot really touch the Navy's budget because we do it 4 years in advance, we put it all together, it's baked, and then you can't touch it. So he cannot, exploit a new technological breakthrough. He has to wait 4 years before they start spending the money on it. So the system was set up for the United States in a period of strategic stasis. You could assume defense budgets were always going to go up a bit. And it was perfect for long-term planning, which, industry was very much in favor of. How easy is it to kill a defense program in the United States? Almost impossible once it gets started. That method was exported here. We don't see readiness. We don't see modernization. What do we see? We see money thought of horizontally. So these are the main programs: personnel, maintenance, and operations, acquisition. And it's very difficult if I go to any Ministry of Defense in the region and I say, how much does that battalion cost per year? How much does it cost to put that ship to sea for a day? How much is a flying hour for that airplane? Very often they can't tell you. Or what's the cost, the annual cost of the squadron? They can't even tell you macro numbers because they're looking at money horizontally. That's how it was exported. And that's how it's been implemented throughout the region. And I have 2 datum for you. 1, you have low readiness. Actually 3. 1, low readiness. 2, I have yet to see a defense plan, to include Romania, that has been endorsed, that has been executed. And the reason being is that they've never been costed. So PPBS has failed in readiness, in producing plans, and thirdly, it's failed because you're thinking of money linearly as opposed to vertically. This is the cost of the battalion. What has happened is it has encouraged bureaucrats, military and civilian bureaucrats, to have a too large organization bigger than the money. If you thought of money vertically, this is what I need to have a real battalion as opposed to a ghost battalion, that way of approach, that method, would make you fit the defense force into the budget. So now you have, in many countries, I would say all of them, you have too much infrastructure. You have disaggregation of capabilities, so you'll buy an airplane, but you won't buy the hours for the pilots. I call that capability incoherence. And I trace that back to this budgetary method, which is used throughout the region, and I'm really surprised that very little criticism has been launched at it, since the data is very clear, that the outputs are not what they should be. And I'm even more surprised that they continue to export it, that it's seen as being the gold standard. Whereas the academic literature, I hate to be an academic here, but the academic literature of planning, programming, budgeting system is universally negative. It really hasn't worked where it's been tried.
And what solutions do we have to replace or improve this system?
It's actually relatively simple. You need to blow up the bureaucracies that do this, and you need to implement something very simplistic, which is you need to think about money vertically, each capability, each activity that you do, and then you have to differentiate. What we're doing in the Department of Navy now, you have three categories. I call them 0, 1, and 2. 0 is what you absolutely have to do. If everything is costed, the battalions, strategic communications, quick reaction alert aircraft, how much does it cost for 24 hours for 2 aircraft? Anything related to sovereignty, you know you have to buy. You have to buy it. You have to defend your national sovereignty, particularly in a country like Romania with your history. So that helps people immediately identify how much to spend. So if I'm running the budget, I'm asking the policy director, what is it we absolutely have to spend? Level 1 are the key capabilities and priority. And this is what the Chief of Defense, policy director, the minister, they agree on. We have to have these capabilities. You rack them, stack them, as we say, that we put them in priority, and at some point there's a red line. The red line is the budget. May go up, may go down. Do you change the priorities? No. But the budget goes up and down. Level 2 is where you don't have any money for it. And there's a rule with some nuances in the Department of Navy they're implementing, which I'm very strongly in favor of, is if it falls below the red line more than 1 year, you could probably do without it. So it puts 2 degrees of discipline in. One, if it's below the red line 1 or 2 years, you can decide it's a policy decision. You get rid of it. You don't waste money on it. You don't waste attention on it. You get rid of it. Now, if you're the Chief of Defense, Chief of Army, Chief of Navy, Chief of Air Force, I understand I have to do level 0. Those are related to sovereignty. But my interest is to keep level 0 as small as possible because it's zero sum. The more money on level 0, the less I have for capabilities. So this is a rather simplistic method that we've developed, my colleagues and I have developed over the last few years. And it's finding acceptance and resonance, but the problem is, you know, in government you can't kill a bad idea, and once you have a bureaucracy around it, it's very, very hard to change.
Yes, that's
anywhere.
How important is the Black Sea and Romania for NATO and United States by extension?
Okay, again, let me stress that I'm speaking as a private individual. I do not reflect U.S. government policy. I have maybe a different view than many people. I've spent a lot of years in this part of the region. I know it very well. And I found it rather amusing after 2014. Many people in Washington in particular discovered the Baltics. They thought this, oh my God, this is a big deal, and the Russians are right there, and you know, Sewicki Gap in Poland, and a lot of attention, and justifiably so. But I've never really bought the scenario that the Russians are going to play in the Baltic. It's too nuanced, there are too many impediments. Down here is a completely different situation. If I look at the Transnistria, I've worked in Moldova for 6-7 years. I know it very well. That's a perfect opportunity to make mischief. You can make mischief for the Ukrainians. You can make mischief for NATO, and particularly for Romania. And if they play games in the Baltic, it's very difficult for many Western allies to not want to respond. If it's something in the Black Sea is far, far away. So I've always thought the Black Sea offered a lot more opportunities for Russian mischief making, to be very blunt. But again, this is my own personal, private opinion. So I think the Black Sea is critical. I think the unknown status or just the policy of Turkey does not help the West concentrate our minds on what Turkish actions could be. As much as I love Turkey and I love its people, I mean, it's still difficult to predict anymore, I think, under the current government. I think and hope that they'll adhere to their NATO obligations as we will, but I just think there's a lot of uncertainty. And you hear this from officials. It's not me, but you hear them from other NATO officials. And then I think you have an underdeveloped capacity in this part of the world to respond. Recognizable radar pictures of the sea surface are weak. Their legacy, they need to be upgraded so we can get a much better picture. The navies in this part of the world, I just published an article this last week in the Naval War College Review looking at the alliances and all of the new alliances navies. And the Black Sea is really one that concerns me a lot, simply because you don't have the weaponry you need, you don't have the radars, you don't have the tactical data links to be able to do accurate and timely targeting. So a lot of work needs to be done there, and I think the U.S. government is responding very quickly and promptly to that. And I'm very happy to be part of that, helping them with their proposals to fix certain things like that. For example, the recognizable radar picture.
Okay, and what Romania can do to improve its security in this region, especially Black Sea region?
Well, I would just suggest that you're probably not getting value for money. You spend a lot of money on defense, but you may not be getting value for money. And I would say, critically, you need to look at how do you make your defense efforts fit the budget. You have to spend more, either larger budget or redistribution within the budget. And of course, 5 years ago, 85% of the budget was going to personnel. That has come down dramatically, and I don't think Romania gets the credit they're due for doing that. That's been painful, but it still isn't enough. Of all the countries in this region, Romania spends the least on operations and maintenance. That is to say, training. And this has got to be addressed. I think officials know that. I think they're working on it, and I laud them for this. But it just doesn't make sense to buy a capability like an F-16 and not to make sure you have the money to ensure that, one, you have enough pilots, and then two, those pilots get on average 180 hours. Your pilots are not getting 180 hours. So they're not fully trained because they haven't had the opportunity to do the formal training to get the certifications. And so you're cheating yourselves. Yes, it's a lot of money to pay for the fuel and the spares and the hours. I understand that. But you've already spent a lot of money on the platforms. So, the example I give is, why would you buy an F-16 without weaponry, which you haven't done, but countries have bought multi-role fighter aircraft without the weaponry? Or two, why would you buy the aircraft without the requisite training to do mid-air refueling? It doesn't make any sense. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, you have to find a tanker. If it's nighttime refueling, I think it has to be recertified every 30 days. It's not exactly easy. But this gets back to the whole issue of capability and coherence. If you don't spend the money on the training and maintenance, you don't have the capability. You can see it, but those poor boys and girls, if they have to deploy, they're not going to be ready. And that's not a good thing.
I would like to speak about the research in this field. As an academic, I know you're involved in the Black Sea program at the University of Bucharest. Could you please make us a brief presentation of the program?
Yeah, I think what Professor Marea Neagră is trying to do is, and I laud him for this, is to bring concerted, consistent effort to look very closely at all of the issues related to security in the Black Sea, to serve as a focal point. I think it's long overdue. If my writings can help in this, I'm here this week as a visiting fellow to that center, and I'm enjoying my time immensely, and I'm learning a lot. It better prepares me for the work that I do, after I leave here throughout the region. So I'm quite pleased to be associated with it, and I hope it gets the support that I think it deserves. And they can go forth and do better things and keep awareness on the necessity of concentrating our mind that the Black Sea is in perilous shape because the balance of power has changed after 2014, in my view, my own personal view. with the Russians, with their missiles in Crimea, they've really changed the balance of power. And the only way we're going to forestall that, any sort of Russian mischief making, is by increasing our presence by Western forces in the region, in accordance, of course, with the Montreux Convention. Let's never forget that. But also improving the capabilities of the NATO allies and continuing to support Turkey in any way we can politically, to keep them, well on side with the West. I would like to think they need us and we need them, as we did, in the early 1950s. And I would hate to see anything happen, to that relationship.